Chapter 1. The village of Charwood Hollow was the kind of place postcards envied. Ivy curling up sandstone cottages, geese waddling through church lanes, and Sundays that moved no faster than the bell in the vicar's tower. It was the afternoon of the annual summer fête, and the village green was alive with bunting, sponge cakes, and brass music struggling to keep time. Miss Marple, seated at a white-painted table under the sycamore tree, stirred her tea with practised ease. Her eyes, kindly and pale, watched everything. Mr. Crabtree arguing about jam weights, young Lydia Fenton laughing too loudly at a joke no one had heard, and the exact moment Reverend Howard dropped his cup when Lady Sedgwick passed by. To the casual eye, it was nothing more than a social hiccup, a porcelain mishap. But Miss Marple's expression didn't flicker. She simply said, "Clumsy," to no one in particular, and took another sip. Beside her, Mrs. Weatherby leaned over, cradling a fruit scone. "Have you seen Lydia this afternoon, Jane? Flitting about like a butterfly. I expect she's finally caught Arthur Bennet's attention." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Arthur's attention tends to go wherever Lydia points it. Mrs. Weatherby chuckled. "Oh, you always see through the frippery. Still, they make a pretty pair." Across the green, a short man with sharp glasses and a too-neat moustache adjusted a silver tie-clip that gleamed just a little too much in the sunlight. He was new. Nobody could quite remember when he'd arrived, or why exactly he was staying at the Rose and Crown Inn. He introduced himself as Mr. Clive Westcom, a retired civil servant, though of what department he had been part, he never clarified. He was the type who nodded before speaking, and always seemed to be evaluating one's answer for hidden meaning. He had just joined the judging panel for the jam competition. "Strawberry, raspberry, and one mystery blend," he announced, lips pursed. "I'll need a palate cleanser." Miss Marple caught the way his eyes lingered on Mrs. Henshaw's trembling hands as she offered her jar, and how Mrs. Henshaw couldn't quite meet his gaze. Strange. The brass band struck a final wobbly note. A light wind blew across the green, rustling skirts and scattering paper napkins. Mr. Weston, the banker, excused himself mid-conversation and headed towards the edge of the green, frowning at something or someone in the crowd. Only Miss Marple noticed that Lady Sedgwick, resplendent in a lavender silk shawl, had suddenly become very still. That evening, the fête concluded with lemonade and a modest raffle draw. The laughter grew looser with the sunset. Clive Westcom accepted a tart from Lydia, made a polished joke about its crust, and wandered toward the beer tent. He was charming in the way overly polite men often are. Like a curtain over a locked door, Miss Marple didn't think he'd be in Charwood Hollow long. As the crowd thinned, Miss Marple excused herself. "My roses won't prune themselves, and I suspect I've lingered too long already." "But Jane, stay for the bonfire," Mrs. Weatherby called. "I know how it ends," Miss Marple said gently, with a soft wave of her hand. "Everything burning to ash." She walked home through the twilight, past neat hedges and uneven fences, her footsteps light and certain. She didn't glance back, but she did recall something small. Mr. Westcom, adjusting his silver tie-clip with his left hand, despite shaking hands with his right all afternoon. Curious. The next morning, The village awoke to the news that Mr. Clive Westcom had been found dead in the back garden of the Rose and Crown, sitting upright in a deck chair, the same silver tie clip gleaming in the chest pocket of his jacket, only now slightly askew. Chapter 2. The news spread as fast as gossip ever does in a village where curtains twitch faster than constables. By the time the milkman reached Miss Marple's gate, the entire high street had already heard. Mr. Westcom was dead, found at dawn by young Billy Harper, who'd gone to retrieve crates from the back of the Rose and Crown. Miss Marple heard it from Mrs. Weatherby, who arrived on her doorstep precisely 15 minutes after breakfast had been cleared, still wearing her house slippers and an apron dusted with flour. In his chair, she whispered, as if death might overhear, just sitting there, stiff as old mutton. Said he looked peaceful, but not natural, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple gently took the offered scone and placed it on a saucer. No sign of distress. None. That's what's odd, Jane. They said he looked perfectly composed, though Dr. Trevelyan's already muttering about the time of death being, what was it? Oh, yes, far earlier than expected. Cold as anything when they found him. Miss Marple murmured, her gaze moving to the little path beyond her rose trellis. The leaves on the privet hedge were damp from last night's mist. And was he alone? They think so. Mrs. Weatherby leaned in, voice dropping. But Lady Sedgwick was at the inn too, you know, visiting the landlord's wife. Some charity committee nonsense. Slept in the east guest room, or so she claims. Miss Marple did not raise her eyebrows, though something flickered behind her pale blue eyes. And Lydia, Mrs. Weatherby added, clearly enjoying her role as informal village correspondent. In hysterics, poor girl. Said he complimented her tart just yesterday, and now gone. Do you think it was his heart? Miss Marple shook her head softly. The heart is rarely so neat. By midday, Inspector Cray had arrived from the county constabulary. A brisk man with a moustache that seemed to disapprove of everyone, he took control with the confidence of a man who liked his cases tidy and brief. He was likely poisoned, he announced to the assembled group at the Rose and Crown. Dr. Trevelyan's preliminary notes suggest as much. Some fast-acting substance. We'll know more after the coroner's done. Poison! Gasped Mrs. Henshaw, clutching her handbag as though it might shield her from arsenic fumes. Miss Marple, who had joined the group quietly, sipped from her thermos and said nothing. Inspector Cray eyed the group. Any of you see Mr. Westcom after sundown yesterday? A few murmurs. Lydia Fenton raised her hand slightly. He came to the beer tent around 9. I gave him a second slice of tart. He seemed well enough. What sort of tart? Cray asked, notebook poised. Cherry and almond, she said, with a touch of vanilla. He scribbled it down. Miss Marple, watching Lydia, noted how her fingers twisted the ribbon at the hem of her dress. Nervous, yes, but not grieving. Mr. Weston, the banker, cleared his throat. I saw him too, briefly. He asked about my sister's estate. Curious question, really. He wanted to know how long it takes probate to clear. I thought it strange at the time. Lady Sedgwick stood apart from the group, hands clasped loosely before her, her face unreadable. The inspector turned to her. And you, my lady, you were also here last night? Yes, she said coolly. I retired early. Mrs. Dobbins will confirm. Did you know the deceased well? No. she replied, "only in passing." But Miss Marple's eyes were on her gloves, butter-soft leather, speckled faintly with soil. Not fresh, hours old perhaps, not gardening gloves either. The inspector moved on to question the innkeeper and his wife, while Miss Marple slipped around the edge of the garden, seemingly inspecting them. The flower beds, the chair Mr. Westcom had died in, remained in place, cordoned off with modest string, and a placard reading, "Do not touch." A small table beside it held an untouched glass of lemonade and a folded handkerchief. She looked down. One petal, bruised and brown, lay beneath the leg of the chair, crushed flat. A rose, white, most likely. Miss Marple straightened and turned to see Reverend Howard approaching, his face pinched. "Terrible business," he muttered, smoothing his lapel. "I never much cared for the man, but murder? In Charwood?" Miss Marple offered him a small smile. "Even Eden had its serpent, Reverend." He sighed. "I do hope this doesn't become a scandal. We have the bishop visiting next month." "Inconvenient," she murmured. They stood quietly, observing the chair. Reverend Howard shifted uncomfortably. "You don't suppose Lydia had anything to do with it?" "I suppose," Miss Marple said softly, "that people often underestimate what a young woman might be capable of, particularly when she's being watched too closely by someone who thinks he knows her secrets." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" But Miss Marple had already turned away. Chapter 3. The air outside St. Mildred's Church hung heavy with midsummer heat, the kind that settled in your collar and turned thoughts sticky. Miss Marple sat beneath a linden tree, knitting needles, quiet in her lap for once, her eyes fixed on the figure that had just stepped from the mid-morning coach. She recognized the cut of the suit first, city-tailored, too crisp for Charwood Hollow. The man adjusted his cuffs with the practiced confidence of someone used to being heard. Then came the voice, smooth and resonant, as he greeted Mrs. Tibbs with a compliment about her roses. Miss Marple remembered voices. She never forgot one that worked too hard to sound effortless. "Is that?" asked Mrs. Weatherby, appearing beside her with a basket of gooseberries. "Mr. Julian Edgecombe," Miss Marple said quietly, "Westcomb's cousin, solicitor from London, formerly of Henley and Murrow's, if memory serves." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Well, I didn't know Mr. Westcombe had any family." "Neither did most," Miss Marple murmured, resuming her knitting, "until now." Julian Edgecombe, immaculately composed, made his way toward the Rose and Crown. His polished leather shoes barely touched the ground, and his silver tie-clip, nearly identical to the deceased's, flashed once in the sun before vanishing into the shadows of the inn. Inside, Inspector Cray was mid-interview with the barmaid when the solicitor introduced himself. "I'm here to settle my cousin's affairs," he said smoothly, offering the inspector a folded letter. "Clive named me executor of his estate." Cray glanced at the seal. "And you've only just arrived?" Julian nodded. "He wrote to me last week, said he'd been feeling unwell. I thought it prudent to check on him myself." "Unwell?" Cray's eyebrows rose. "He seemed in good health, to the rest of us." "Yes, well," Julian said, unfazed. "Clive was always discreet with his ailments. We are not a family that likes to be fussed over." From the corner, Miss Marple, quietly seated with her tea, tilted her head ever so slightly. Not a flicker of grief in Julian's expression. Not even the show of concern. Inspector Cray asked, "Did your cousin have any known enemies?" Julian's smile was patient. Clive had the sort of personality that left people either charmed or slightly bruised. But enemies? No. Though I did once warn him that charming too many young women at once would lead to trouble. At this, Lydia Fenton, who had just entered with a tray of cutlery, nearly dropped a spoon. Miss Marple glanced her way. "Are you all right, my dear?" Lydia's eyes darted. "Fine, just startled. That man sounds just like him." In truth, their tones were distinct. Julian spoke silk. Clive had wielded charm like a scalpel. But perhaps Lydia was hearing something deeper, or remembering something she shouldn't. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a gentle stroll to Little Bramble Cottage, where Lady Sedgwick had recently taken up temporary residence. The garden was overgrown, but artfully so, a theatrical kind of neglect. The lady herself was on the veranda, a silk shawl draped around her shoulders despite the heat. She offered Miss Marple tea with the kind of smile that came from years of fencing in drawing rooms. "I do hope you don't mind the intrusion," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's such a comfort to share tea with someone who understands discretion." Lady Sedgwick tilted her head. "Discretion is often mistaken for indifference, Miss Marple. And yet it's often the only virtue left standing when the dust settles," Miss Marple said, stirring her cup. "You were acquainted with Mr. Westcom in town, I believe?" There was the smallest pause, half a breath. "Briefly," she said. "He had ambitions. A minor flirtation long ago. Nothing of substance." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "and yet substance is often what poisons an otherwise tolerable acquaintance." The teacups clinked. Lady Sedgwick smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I think it's natural for people to exaggerate connections when someone dies unexpectedly. Everyone wants to natter to the story." "Some," Miss Marple said gently, "would prefer not to be in the story at all." The silence stretched. That evening, as twilight fell, Julian Edgecombe walked alone along the garden path behind the Rose and Crown, hands behind his back. From her parlour window, Miss Marple noted the way he paused by the deck chair, the one where Clive had died, and bent slightly, brushing something from the seat. She waited. The next morning, she visited Reverend Howard with a simple request: access to the parish's old land sale records. He seemed bemused, but agreed. "Curious about our cottages, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Curious," she replied, "about why a man who claimed to have only just arrived sent money to the Vicarage's Restoration Fund last month, signed in the name of his cousin." Chapter 4. By Tuesday morning, the village had found its first suspect, and her name was already in every whispered conversation, from the bakery to the post office: Lydia Fenton. "She was the last to see him," said Mrs. Bletchley, clucking over a rack of bread at Elspeth's tea shop. "Gave him a tart, didn't she? Always was a bit forward, that one." "Pretty, but slippery," added Mr. Tibbs. "One smile and you'd forget she hadn't answered the question." Miss Marple, seated by the window with a pot of Earl Grey and half a currant bun, observed the gossip as she might observe the weather. Something natural, inevitable, and sometimes useful. Outside, Lydia moved quickly through the high street, chin tucked, coat buttoned despite the warmth. She entered the shop briefly, then retreated before anyone could stop her. Guilt or fear, or simply exhaustion. "Such a pity," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, joining Miss Marple at the table. "Her mother's nerves won't stand this. And Arthur Bennett's keeping his distance now, have you noticed?" "I have," Miss Marple said, "which may be more revealing than it seems." Meanwhile, Inspector Cray was wasting no time. Dear had summoned Lydia to the constable's office at the back of the library that morning. The room was sparse, just a desk, 2 chairs, and the faint smell of aging paper. Miss Marple, of course, was not invited, but she knew how to learn what she needed. The conversation went as follows, relayed later by Mrs. Dobbins, who, just, happened to overhear, while shelving books in the adjacent room. "You were seen offering Mr. Westcom tart," Cray had said. "Were you alone with him?" "Yes, but only for a moment." "Did he seem well?" "He joked. He flirted. He always did." "And you, how did you feel about him?" There was a pause. Then, "He scared me sometimes." That, more than anything else, had set tongues wagging. But Miss Marple knew the truth was often more delicate than village opinion could grasp. A half-truth here, a misremembered detail there, it could all spiral into nonsense. Instead, she chose her next step carefully. At noon, she paid a visit to the chemist's shop, run by the meticulous Mr. Lorimer, who prided himself on privacy, but adored subtle compliments on his record-keeping. "I wonder," she said sweetly, "whether you might recall if Mr. Westcom had purchased anything out of the ordinary." Mr. Lorimer straightened. "Nothing I'd call unusual. Antacid tablets, a mild sleeping draught, lavender-based, perfectly ordinary, harmless." "Did he ever inquire about poisons?" He blinked. "Certainly not to me. I'd have remembered." Miss Marple nodded. Of course, though if one were hoping to obtain something quietly, one might send someone else on their behalf. Mr. Lorimer frowned. "Now that you mention it, there was a purchase made last Thursday. A tincture containing belladonna. For migraines, ostensibly. It was paid for by Miss Lydia Fenton." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "And she suffered migraines before?" "Not that I'm aware of." That evening, a small, unannounced gathering formed in Reverend Howard's parlour. Present were Inspector Cray, Miss Marple, Lydia, pale but composed, and Julian Edgecombe, who had taken an interest in how the investigation was proceeding. "I hope you don't mind my presence," Julian said. "As executor, I feel a certain duty." "I suppose your sense of duty includes questioning grieving young women now?" Lydia snapped. Cray raised a hand. "Let's keep this civil." Miss Marple, quietly sipping lukewarm tea, said nothing until the silence had worn itself thin. "I believe," she said gently, "that we're asking the wrong questions." Everyone turned. "It's not whether Lydia gave him tart," she continued, "but why he accepted a second slice when he'd already complained of indigestion earlier that evening." Lydia blinked. "He said it helped his heartburn, that the cherry settled it." "Cherry rarely does," Miss Marple replied, setting down her cup, "unless one believes it will, and that requires trust." Julian leaned forward. "Are you suggesting Lydia poisoned him with tart?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, looking directly at Lydia, "that someone knew Lydia's tart would make a convenient vessel, that her reputation would carry suspicion without effort." Cray furrowed his brow. But she purchased the belladonna. Yes, Miss Marple said, and perhaps she even delivered it, believing it harmless. That, too, can be arranged, especially if one trusts the wrong person. Lydia looked down at her hands. He said it was for his nerves, that he couldn't sleep. I thought I was helping. And did he often ask you for favours? Miss Marple asked softly. Lydia hesitated. Yes, and he always made me feel as if saying no would be unkind. The room grew still. Julian's voice broke the silence. So we're left with an unfortunate mistake then. A misunderstanding? Miss Marple's gaze held his. That's one possibility. But her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Outside, dusk draped the village in golden shadow. And in the quiet corner of her mind, Miss Marple began to assemble the pattern, not yet complete but no longer a blur. Something too deliberate in Julian's interest, something too rehearsed in his account. And above all, something false about the way the villagers had so quickly chosen a scapegoat, as if they had been helped along. Chapter 5. The morning after the parlour meeting unfolded with deceptive quiet. Charwood Hollow resumed its routine with determined normalcy. Curtains were drawn back, windows polished, eggs delivered, and remarks about weather exchanged with stiff smiles. But beneath that polite rhythm, the air was denser, heavier. Miss Marple's cottage, the roses were being pruned, though she hardly seemed to notice the thorns. Her mind worked not in flowers, but in motives, false trails and performances. Poison hidden not just in tart, but in conversation. A note had arrived an hour earlier, hand-delivered unsigned, written in a hurried hand. Come to the trellis, behind the church. Noon. No one must see you. She had seen dozens like it in her life, some foolish, some desperate. She had seen dozens like it in her life, some foolish, some desperate. This felt neither. It felt afraid. So at noon, she made her way to the ivy-covered trellis behind St. Mildred's, a half-forgotten path once used by choir boys taking shortcuts and young lovers avoiding chaperones. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and growing things. She arrived early, as was her habit, and waited. At precisely 2 minutes past the hour, a figure emerged from the far side. Mrs. Henshaw, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the heat, her face pale and her steps hesitant. I didn't want anyone to see me speaking with you, she said, eyes darting. Not after what happened. Of course, Miss Marple said gently. Would you like to sit? They settled on the edge of a crumbling stone bench. Ivy curled up around their shoes. A bee buzzed near a forgotten bird bath. I think I saw something, Mrs. Henshaw said at last. The night of the fête, only I wasn't sure until yesterday. Go on. It was after the music ended. I'd gone round to the east path to find my shawl. Silly of me, I left it near the beer tent. And I saw someone in the vicarage garden. A man, tall, light-coloured suit. He was near the trellis. Could you see his face? No, but I saw his hands. He was removing something from the base of the ivy, something wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple waited. When I walked past there this morning, Mrs. Henshaw continued, voice shaking slightly, I looked. I couldn't help myself. I thought I imagined it all. But something was still there. They rose and walked together to the base of the trellis. It didn't take long. Buried just beneath the damp soil and trailing ivy was a bundle wrapped in faded linen, water-stained but intact. Inside, a small glass vial, empty, with a hairline crack, and a piece of silk torn from a man's pocket, square, silver grey, monogrammed faintly with the initials J.E. Julian Edgecombe. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Then she folded the linen again and slipped it into her basket. "Best not to mention this to anyone just yet, dear," she murmured. "There's more to be found before we disturb the dust." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a second visit to Mr. Weston, the banker. His office above the bakery was stuffy and smelled faintly of stale ink and lemon biscuits. "Miss Marple," he said, slightly startled, "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I hoped to inquire," she said pleasantly, "about Mr. Westcom's recent financial activity, purely out of idle curiosity." He hesitated. "Well, there was something. Confidential, of course. He withdrew a large sum the day before the fête. Quite unusual for him. Cash? Yes. £1,000 in banknotes, said it was for a private matter. No record of where it went after." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "And his cousin, Mr. Edgecombe, has he made any requests regarding the estate yet?" "He's asked for access to the ledger. Said he needs to verify which accounts were joint." "Joint?" she asked, eyebrows rising. Mr. Weston shifted in his seat. "It seems Mr. Westcom had recently signed papers adding Mr. Edgecombe to one of his investment portfolios. Quite legal, but it hadn't been finalized before his death. So, if Mr. Westcom had died, say, a week later, the assets would have passed to Julian automatically. No need for probate." "Curious timing," she said softly. Back at the Rose and Crown, Inspector Cray was growing restless. His theory had stalled, tangled in contradictory witness statements and a lack of hard evidence. Miss Fenton's still the only one with a motive, he grumbled to Miss Marple later that evening. Love gone sour, perhaps, or shame. Miss Marple gently tapped the rim of her teacup. "You assume it was a matter of the heart, and you don't?" "No," she said. "I think it was a matter of money and fear." He frowned. "Then, who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the garden behind the inn, where the deck chair still sat empty, its cushion faintly indented. From here, she could just make out the ivy on the church wall, and the quiet place where someone had buried a vial and a piece of silk that ought never to have been lost. Chapter 6. The first sign that something was amiss came not with thunder, but with paperwork. That afternoon, a plain brown envelope arrived at Mr. Weston's office, delivered by courier from London. Inside it was a scanned copy of a legal document, Clive Westcom's revised will. It had been drafted the week before his arrival in Charwood Hollow, but had never been officially signed. Julian Edgecombe, summoned at once, reviewed the document with care. "This is nonsense," he said crisply. "Clive and I spoke the night before he died. He told me he had finalized everything." Mr. Weston cleared his throat. "It appears he intended to cut you out." Julian's gaze sharpened. "That's ridiculous. He made me executor." "Oh, did?" Weston said, in the older version. "But this newer draft leaves his entire estate to a woman named Lydia Fenton." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut linen. Miss Marple who had anticipated as much, said nothing. But inside her mind, the web began to shift. Why Lydia? Why now? And more importantly, who knew about the change before Clive died? That evening, at the vicarage's annual stitching circle, Miss Marple found herself beside Lady Sedgwick once again. The air in the drawing-room smelled of lemon polish and sandalwood. The click of needles and occasional murmur of gossip served as a soft backdrop to deeper thoughts. "You knew Clive Westcom in London," Miss Marple said without pretense. Lady Sedgwick didn't look up from her embroidery. "Yes, briefly, and I liked him very little." "Why?" "He was greedy," she said, "but patient, the most dangerous kind." Miss Marple nodded. "And he was rewriting his will." That made Lady Sedgwick pause, just for a heartbeat. "I see," she said. "And did he finish it?" "No. Pity. For someone." The conversation drifted, but Miss Marple had what she needed. The pause, the flicker, the unsaid recognition of what a half-finished will could do in the right or wrong hands. The next day, Inspector Cray called an unofficial meeting in the reading room of the inn. Present: Lydia Fenton, Julian Edgecombe, Miss Marple, and Mr. Weston. Cray paced near the fireplace, a sheaf of papers in one hand. "We have reason to believe," he said, "that Mr. Westcombe intended to change his will. The unsigned draft suggests a complete redirection of his estate. Westcombe intended to change his will. The unsigned draft suggests a complete redirection of his estate to Miss Fenton." Lydia's eyes widened. "I didn't know. He never told me." "Perhaps not directly," Cray said, "but it does raise the possibility of motive." "A great deal of money was at stake," Julian interjected smoothly. "Let's not forget this is a draft, not a legal will. My position remains unchanged unless something else comes to light." Miss Marple observed the dynamic carefully. Lydia, shocked but sincere. Cray, fixed on motive. Julian, pressing control. "May I ask," she said calmly, "where the original draft was discovered?" Mr. Weston answered. "In Clive's London flat. His solicitor forwarded it once they were alerted to his death." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "Julian claimed Clive told him everything was finalized." Julian's lips thinned. "I was told so. Perhaps my cousin had second thoughts." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps someone intercepted the will before Clive could sign it." Cray looked up. "What are you suggesting?" "I suggest," Miss Marple said, "that the unsigned draft was never meant to be found. It was a buried truth, like the silk square behind the ivy trellis. The real question is, who knew about it and who had reason to ensure it remained unsigned?" Julian stood smoothing his tie. "You tread dangerously close to libel, Miss Marple." "No," she said, eyes steady. "I tread close to motive." Room tensed. Julian's voice lost its polish. "This is preposterous." But Cray was no longer ignoring the inconsistencies. "We'll be verifying the timeline of your arrival in Charwood, Mr. Edgecombe, and looking into your financial records." Julian turned toward the inspector. "Are you accusing me of murder?" "Not yet," Cray replied, "but I'm no longer ruling you out." That night, Miss Marple walked alone to the edge of the village, where the road forked between the hills and the woods. The air was heavy, and clouds gathered low. She thought of Lydia. Young, manipulated perhaps, used by Clive, and now left to bear the weight of a legacy she didn't ask for. She thought of Julian, controlled, rehearsed, too prepared for grief. And she thought of something Mrs. Henshaw had once said, almost absently, when describing the fête. I remember the band went sharp just as Lady Sedgwick passed by. I swear Clive looked surprised to see her. Surprised, which meant he hadn't expected her there, which meant someone else had invited her. But who? Miss Marple turned back toward the village, her steps firm. There was more than one secret in Charwood Hollow, and someone, perhaps more than one, was lying. Chapter 7. The day of the second death began innocently. Breezes through barley fields, children skipping stones at the brook, and the clinking of teacups on china. But Charwood Hollow had changed. A hush hung over the village, not from mourning, but from anticipation, as if everyone sensed that something had been set in motion and could not be stopped. Miss Marple rose early, unsettled by a feeling she could not yet name. The pieces were shifting. She felt them in the silences between words, in the glances that lingered too long, and in the contradictions people didn't notice they spoke. At noon, she visited Mrs. Dobbins, who kept the parish guest book and managed the Rose and Crowns guest records with fastidious pride. Julian Edgecombe signed in at 4:15 the day of the fête, she said, tapping the leather-bound ledger. But he was seen in the village before that, wasn't he? Miss Marple nodded. He visited the vicarage, made a donation. That would have been before noon. Mrs. Dobbins blinked. Well now, that's not right, unless he arrived earlier than he claimed, Miss Marple said softly, and delayed signing the register. That evening, the sunset came earlier than expected. Clouds gathered thick over the western fields, and by 6:30, lamps glowed in windows like watchful eyes. It was under this grey hush that Lady Sedgwick was found, face down on the gravel path behind Little Bramble Cottage, her shawl tangled around her arm, a cut on her temple, and no sign of struggle, only a faint smear of blood on the garden gate latch. She was not dead yet, but she was dying. Miss Marple was among the first called. She arrived just behind Dr. Trevelyan, who knelt beside the unconscious woman and muttered something grim. She has minutes, he said, if that. Lady Sedgwick's eyes fluttered once. Her lips moved. Miss Marple leaned close, careful not to touch. The voice was barely audible. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. He said no one would know. The will. Then nothing but breath, fading. Dr. Trevelyan closed his eyes. It's done. The silence that followed was not reverent. It was terrified. By morning, the village had entered a new phase, the age of speculation. 2 deaths, a missing signature, a tangled inheritance, and now a woman with power and secrets gone under mysterious circumstances. She fell, Inspector Cray said. That's what the doctor thinks. She bled, Miss Marple replied, from her head, but her hands had soil beneath the nails. One doesn't dig flower beds at dusk. Cray frowned. Then what do you believe happened? I believe she knew something, and that she meant to act on it. Cray exhaled slowly. You think she was silenced, I think, Miss Marple said. She was warned, and in the end, the warning became the act. Later that afternoon, Cray received a letter from the Metropolitan Police, sent upon his earlier request. Julian Edgecombe, it revealed, had been struck off the rolls 3 years ago for falsifying signatures in an inheritance dispute, quietly covered up, never prosecuted, but never forgotten either. Miss Marple received the information calmly, as though she had known all along. She found Lydia that evening near the stream at the edge of the village, sitting cross-legged on a rock, tossing pebbles into the shallows. The light had turned silver blue, and the water shimmered like glass. "I didn't kill him," Lydia said before Miss Marple could speak. "Even if he was planning to leave me everything. I believe you. But everyone else is looking for the simplest explanation," Miss Marple said, "which is almost never the true one." Lydia hugged her knees. "He used to talk about trust like it was a trick, like you gave it to someone so they'd owe you something." "And that's how he lived," Miss Marple murmured, "transactional until he overreached." They sat in silence a while longer. Then Lydia said, "Lady Sedgwick visited me once, just after the fête. She said Clive was dangerous. She said he'd tried it before, with someone else, and that he was always cleaning up his own messes with charm." "Did she tell you who that someone else was?" Lydia shook her head. "But I think she was afraid." Miss Marple nodded once. It was enough. That night, back in her cottage, she lit a single lamp and pulled out her notes. The names, the movements, the contradictions. She arranged them not chronologically, but psychologically. Clive, charming and manipulative, had planned to leave his cousin out. Julian, already disgraced, had a reason to intervene. Lady Sedgwick, entangled long ago, knew more than she said, and now she was dead. Miss Marple picked up the monogram silk square, unfolded it gently, and ran her thumb along the edge. There, stitched near the seam, was a second set of initials, C.W. Clive Westcom, which meant the square had never belonged to Julian. It had belonged to Clive. And someone had planted it, hoping to frame Julian, or distract from the truth. The killer was clever, but not clever enough. Chapter 8. The morning after Lady Sedgwick's death broke with strange stillness. No bells rang at St. Mildred's. The grocer's bell didn't chime. Even the birds outside Miss Marple's window seemed to sing more quietly than usual. She sipped her tea without distraction. The cup trembled faintly in her hands, not from nerves, but from something rarer. Readiness. She had waited long enough. The trap, she decided, must be set today. But not loudly, not with spectacle, not with confrontation, with silence. It began at the Rose and Crown, shortly before midday. She arrived with a modest cake tin and asked for Lydia. "Fenton, just a few slices of gingerbread," Miss Marple said sweetly, "and a word or two, if she's free." Lydia came down after a moment, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, but no longer filled with fear. "I'm not hungry," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but you are brave." They sat in the small parlour, the windows half-shuttered, light falling in narrow stripes across the table. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, "what do you remember about the silver tie-clip Clive wore?" Lydia frowned. "He fiddled with it constantly. Smug little thing. Said it was custom-made in Rome." Miss Marple nodded. "Did anyone else touch it?" "Julian picked it up once. Said it was vulgar." Miss Marple paused. And yet the one Julian wears now is identical. Lydia blinked. I hadn't noticed. I suspect you weren't meant to. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to see Inspector Cray, who had grown red-eyed and silent over the past 2 days. I need a favour, she said plainly. One that might earn you the truth. I'm listening, he said, though wearily. It'd like you to call a meeting tomorrow morning at the church hall. Quietly invite Julian Edgecombe, Mr. Weston, and Lydia. Tell them it's for the final reading of the will. No police, no pressure, just formality. Cray frowned. That's not procedure. No, Miss Marple agreed. It's strategy. Left him to decide. Then she returned home, where she removed something from her side drawer. A small silver tie clip, cleaned of all trace of dust and smudges. Not Clive's, not Julian's, but something else entirely. A replica, crafted by the watchmaker's boy in Lower Bramble Lane, based on a sketch she'd given him 3 days ago. Just close enough to fool someone. The next morning came sharp and bright, as if the sun had finally decided the village had suffered long enough. The church hall was quiet. Tea had been set out. Scones stood on a tray. Miss Marple arrived early and sat alone for a moment, her basket on her lap. At 10 sharp, the others entered. Julian, tailored and cold. Lydia, cautious but present. Mr. Weston, uncertain. And finally, Inspector Cray, who entered without his uniform, but with eyes more alert than anyone else's. Thank you all for coming, Miss Marple said warmly. There's just one matter left, you see. The tie clip. Julian raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. I found it, she said, opening her basket. Not in Clive's room, not in yours, but in the garden, beneath the bench where Clive last sat. She lifted the replica and set it on the table. Cray watched without blinking. Funny thing about silver, Miss Marple said gently. It tarnishes. And this one, well, it didn't. Julian moved slightly in his chair. So I had it examined, she continued. And it isn't silver at all, just polished steel, mass-produced, bought from a shop in Islington 2 weeks ago, by a man who paid in cash. She turned her eyes to him. A man who knew the original would be taken by police as evidence. So he purchased a second, a prop, something to wear after the fact, to make it appear that he and his cousin shared a style, a vanity, something to draw suspicion away from himself. Julian said nothing. Miss Marple pressed on, voice like the slow glide of a knife through silk. But that's not all. Because the monogrammed silk square, the one planted beneath the trellis, it bore Clive's initials. But it wasn't torn in a fight. It was cut with precision, not panic. Cray leaned forward. Meaning, Miss Marple said softly, that it was planted after Clive's death. And not by Lydia, not by Lady Sedgwick, but by someone with access to the scene. Someone who expected the police to find it. Julian stood abruptly. This is absurd. Miss Marple rose as well, calm and steady. You arrived in Charwood before you claimed. You asked about the estate. You forged a donation in Clive's name. You knew he was about to change the will, and you knew your share was slipping away. She stepped closer. So you came early. You confronted him. Perhaps you begged. Perhaps you threatened. But Clive refused. And so you did what you were already trained to do. You falsified the timeline. And then you falsified the man. Clive opened his mouth, then closed it. Cray stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're under arrest, he said, for the murder of Clive Westcom, and pending further investigation, the suspicious death of Lady Sedgwick. Julian's expression fractured. For the first time his voice cracked. It wasn't meant to go that far. But Miss Marple was already turning away. In the silence that followed, In the silence that followed, she reached for a cup of tea. Funny thing about murder, she murmured. It tends to overcomplicate itself, just like liars do. Chapter 9. The church hall had emptied by noon, leaving behind the faint scent of tea leaves and sun-warmed wood polish. Inspector Cray remained seated, reviewing his notes in silence. Lydia had left in quiet relief, escorted by Mr. Weston. Only Miss Marple stayed behind, knitting in hand, though her needles barely moved. "Do you ever tire of being right?" Cray asked without looking up. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I don't find it tiresome, only tragic sometimes." He nodded. "Would you mind laying it out for me, from the beginning, everything?" She lowered the knitting to her lap and folded her hands. "Of course," she began simply. Clive Westcom was not liked, but he was clever. He made people feel watched, beholden, even after a smile. He had power, not through strength, but through secrets. And secrets, Mr. Cray, are currency in small places. Clive had arrived in Charwood Hollow under the pretext of rest. But in truth, he came to reposition himself, Miss Marple explained, to extract advantage from old acquaintances, even from Lydia, whom he had begun grooming toward affection or dependence. But Clive made one mistake, she continued. He threatened to disinherit Julian Edgecombe, and Julian knew it. The draft of the new will was no secret. It was a warning. Julian, disbarred and disgraced, had followed his cousin to Charwood. He arrived early, used Clive's name to donate at the vicarage, and then delayed signing in at the inn, fabricating a later arrival. All to create the illusion that Clive was alive and well after their fatal encounter. But he needed the murder to look natural, she said. He chose poison, likely slipped into the second slice of cherry tart, which he coaxed Clive into accepting from Lydia. Poisoning by proxy. Very old-fashioned, and very effective. Cray nodded slowly. And Lady Sedgwick? Miss Marple's voice softened. She knew Julian's past. I suspect she came to warn Clive, or to confront Julian. But when Clive died and Julian stayed, she realized something, that she was a witness, even without knowing the full truth. She tried to keep quiet, but someone realized her knowledge, posed a threat. She was lured outside. Perhaps she confronted Julian, or he her. A shove, a fall, but not an accident. Cray sighed. And the tie clip? Miss Marple reached into her basket and withdrew the replica once again. It was bait. Julian's arrogance was always in the details. He thought himself subtle, but his was a performance built on assumptions that no one would notice when the tie clip changed, or when his timeline didn't match, or that the monogrammed silk beneath the trellis wasn't his to begin with. She held up the cloth. The initials were Clive's. The planting was clumsy. It was done to frame Julian. but only after Julian realized suspicion might fall on him. So he chose a dramatic misdirection. But I had the silk tested. It had residue of soil only from the south side of the garden, where Julian was never seen, and only one person was seen near the trellis late that night. Mrs. Henshaw, Cray muttered. She saw the planting, didn't realize what she'd witnessed, but she came forward when fear made her brave. And the money? Cray asked. The £1,000 Clive withdrew. Insurance, Miss Marple said. Likely intended for Lady Sedgwick, or someone else who held something over him. Perhaps hush money. We may never know to whom. But we do know that the money is now missing. Cray rubbed his forehead. And Lydia? She was manipulated, Miss Marple said. Used. He made her deliver the belladonna under the pretense of helping him sleep. She believed him. That belief nearly ruined her. Cray rose and walked to the window. Outside, the sun struck the top of the church spire. She's lucky you believed her. No, Miss Marple said quietly. She's lucky I paid attention. People often speak the truth when they're not trying to prove anything. Cray turned back. So it's done. The charges will hold. They must, Miss Marple said, for everyone's sake, especially the villages. People need endings. She rose, gathered her things, and offered him a soft smile. One last thing, she said. Do check Julian's suitcases before he's transferred. I suspect you'll find the missing £1,000, and perhaps a copy of Clive's original will, altered. Cray gave her a long look, then smiled in spite of himself. You know, Miss Marple, the force could use someone like you. Picked up her knitting once more. No, she said gently. The force needs people who still believe justice comes in uniforms. I work best in cardigans and whispers. Chapter 10. The arrest of Julian Edgecombe sent ripples through Charwood Hollow like a stone cast into still water. The news travelled swiftly, but not loudly. It passed between hands over church bulletins, between glances at market stalls, and in the hushed exchanges beside the hedgerows. But the villagers didn't celebrate. Not openly. There had been too many shadows this summer, too many truths buried beneath rosebeds and teacups. Miss Marple, ever discreet, returned to her routine, as if it had never been interrupted. Morning walks, afternoon stitches, and evening reflections. But inside, she knew there was one last piece still missing. A confirmation not from deduction, but from record. It arrived 3 days after the arrest, sealed in a plain envelope and delivered by bicycle from the county records office. Inspector Cray brought it to her himself. Thought you might want to be the first to see it, he said, handing over the packet. Miss Marple opened it without hurry. Inside was a typed letter, signed by a legal clerk in London. Alongside it, a scanned copy of a handwritten note dated 4 days before Clive Westcom's death. The ink was rushed, the words uneven. To be witnessed later, I, Clive Westcom, hereby revoke my prior testament and leave my estate to Miss Lydia Fenton, for her kindness and integrity, qualities I long lacked myself. Julian Edgecombe is to be removed from all executorship. Signed, Clive Westcom. Cray let out a breath. So it's true. Everything you said. He intended to cut Julian out completely. Miss Marple nodded. He didn't live to finalize it, but he tried. That attempt matters, and now it's recorded. There was silence for a moment. Then Cray asked, "Will the court accept this?" "They'll argue," Miss Marple said, "but the timeline, the motive, and the witness statements will do the rest. Julian's attempt to forge a new version only adds to the weight against him." Cray rubbed the back of his neck. "I never thought it would come from a tie clip." Miss Marple smiled. "Murders often begin with something small. A misstep, a lie told too confidently, or in this case, a detail meant to distract that did precisely the opposite." That afternoon she visited Lydia, who had taken leave from her job at the inn, and was now staying in her mother's cottage at the edge of the lane. The air in the sitting room smelled of honeysuckle and lemon polish. Lydia looked pale, but her shoulders no longer hunched. "I heard they found something in Julian's case," she said. "The money. A forged will." Miss Marple nodded. "It won't undo what happened, but it will protect what comes next." Lydia looked out the window. "Do you think people will ever stop looking at me sideways?" "In time," Miss Marple said gently. "People always look first. Then they forget. Then they invent. Let them. You know who you are. That's all that matters." Lydia nodded, biting her lip. "Lady Sedgwick tried to protect me, didn't she?" "She tried to protect a version of you," Miss Marple replied. "The kind she might have once been, before the wrong man taught her to be afraid." They sat in silence, the breeze moving the curtain slightly, like a slow breath through fabric. Then Lydia asked, "Why did Clive leave it all to me? Why not his cousin, or anyone else?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Because, in the end, he recognized something he'd never had himself. Someone who gave without needing anything back. It shamed him. And sometimes, even the worst people want to leave something good behind before they go." Lydia didn't answer, but her eyes glistened. Miss Marple rose to leave. Outside, the village seemed to breathe again. Slowly, carefully, as if the weight had not lifted entirely, but shifted just enough to let light pass through. That evening, as dusk settled on Charwood Hollow, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, a new letter half written, and a cup of cooling tea by her side. The window was open, letting in the gentle hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of hollyhocks. She wrote, "There is no neatness in justice, only a quiet acceptance. The guilty are punished, yes, but not always before the innocent suffer. Yet we do what we can. We stitch the pieces, soothe the damage, and hold the memory of truth while others forget it." Outside, the lamps flickered on. One by one, the mystery was closed, but the village, like life, continued, untidy, tender, and always watching. Chapter 11. August came quietly to Charwood Hollow. The hedgerows bloomed late, the roses climbed higher on the cottage walls, and the market resumed its gentle noise. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Not in any one person, but in the rhythm of the village itself. It had learned, as all small places do when tragedy visits, to breathe differently. Just a little slower, just a little deeper. Julian Edgecombe had been formally charged. His name, once said with a kind of worldly admiration, now carried a cautionary silence. The papers had taken interest, briefly, and then moved on to a scandal in Parliament. Charwood preferred it that way. In the parish graveyard, Lady Sedgwick's headstone was set without fanfare. Miss Marple attended the quiet ceremony, standing at the back, her gloved hands folded before her. She deserved more, Lydia said beside her. She had more, Miss Marple replied softly. A life far richer than the part most saw. But women like her are often remembered for the final scene, not the full play. Lydia looked away. She tried to warn me. And she succeeded. Back at the Rose and Crown, the deck chair where Clive Westcom had died had long since been removed. The grass had grown back in, and Mrs. Dobbins had set a flower pot in its place, a forget-me-not, small and bright. No one mentioned its symbolism, but everyone noticed. The village had moved forward in its own way. Inspector Cray no longer asked for updates. Mr. Weston resumed his Monday chess games. Even Mrs. Henshaw, once so jittery, began again to frequent the grocer's with less glancing over her shoulder, and Miss Marple, she returned to her roses, to her letters, to her teas and embroidery circles. But she walked slower now, when passing the vicarage, and when she saw Lydia outside her mother's cottage, painting the porch rail by hand, she paused to admire not just the brushwork, but the clarity of someone rebuilding their life from ashes. One afternoon, Lydia approached her with an envelope. "It came today," she said, "from Clive's solicitor in London. The estate's been formally settled." Miss Marple accepted the letter and opened it. Inside was confirmation that Lydia was now the legal heir to everything Clive had left behind. His modest investments, his accounts, his property shares. "It feels strange," Lydia said, "like it belongs to someone else." "It doesn't," Miss Marple said, "but you're allowed to use it differently. That's the gift." Lydia hesitated. "There's enough to start over. I've been thinking of leaving the Hollow. A bakery, maybe, by the coast. Quiet, clean." "A new name, too?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lydia smiled. "Not for me, but, or maybe for the bakery." That evening, Miss Marple wrote the final lines in a letter she'd been composing for several days. "Some murders are messy, impulsive and done in heat. Others are slow, planned with careful smiles and poisoned words, but they all leave bruises, visible or not. The cleverest killers I've found are not those who hide their weapons, but those who disguise motive as affection. Julian Edgecombe wore grief like a borrowed coat, creased in all the wrong places. But the truth, when spoken softly and patiently, has a way of settling in the corners people forget to sweep. In the end, it's not the murder that defines a place, but the way the survivors carry the silence after." She set down her pen. The light outside faded into a soft twilight. The cottage breathed quietly around her, and for the first time in weeks, there was no weight in the air. There would be more deaths some day, more lies and smiles too wide. But for now, in this little village with its hedgerows and secrets, the truth had held firm. And Miss Marple, quiet, constant and observant, was already watching the next ripple before it began.